On a bright Saturday in midsummer, July 16th, 1054, the great dome of Hagia Sophia held its usual pageant of light and incense. Sun fell in pale sheets through the high windows, touched the gold tesserae, and made the face of Christ in the apse seem to watch the human bustle below with a calm older than empires. The clergy moved in their measured choreography. A choir's chant rose and sank like surf against marble. Then 3 Latin clerics, foreign in dress, in bearing, and in the stiff confidence of men who spoke for a distant authority, walked down the nave toward the altar. At their head was Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, a hard, learned man with the temper of a jurist and the certainty of a reformer. He carried a parchment sealed with lead. Without waiting for the end of the liturgy, he laid it upon the altar as one lays down a weapon. The paper was a bull of excommunication. For a moment it was only an object, ink on skin, wax and cord. But in that act, the two halves of Christendom, which had long been pulling apart like tectonic plates beneath a shared sea, felt the tremor become a crack. The legates turned and left. At the doors, so the story goes, they shook the dust from their feet. In a city that believed itself still the living Rome, the gesture carried the cold finality of a divorce pronounced in public. Yet no schism of a civilization is made in a single morning, nor by a single parchment, nor even by the anathemas that follow. Such moments are symbols, formal knots tied at the end of long, fraying ropes. When Humbert laid his bull upon the altar, he set down centuries of differing tongues and temperaments, of rival political necessities, of theologians sharpening syllables into spears, of bishops and emperors disputing precedence with the passion of men who believe the order of heaven depends upon the order of their ceremonies. The Great Schism, by which posterity usually means the sundering between the Latin Church of Rome and the Greek Church of Constantinople, was less a sudden fall than a slow drift, like continents separating so gradually that only an earthquake tells the living that the map has changed. In the beginning, there had been no East and West as later centuries imagined them, only the scattered communities of a persecuted faith, tied by letters, visiting teachers, and a shared set of stories about a Galilean who had died and, so his followers insisted, had risen. Christianity was born into an empire already bilingual in its upper reaches and multilingual in its provinces. Greek was the language of the Eastern Mediterranean's educated classes and of the earliest Christian scriptures. Latin was the idiom of law and administration in the West. Both were imperial tongues. Neither belonged exclusively to the Church. The first centuries of Christian life were spent less in contemplation of primacy than in survival, meeting in homes, burying the dead, arguing over prophecy and discipline, and occasionally producing martyrs whose courage was a kind of preaching. Rome, as the capital, naturally acquired a certain prestige. Its church could claim the memory of Peter and Paul and could display a continuity that impressed provincials. But it was one among several great sees, Antioch, Alexandria, later Jerusalem, each with its own apostolic legends and its own theological schools. The conversion of emperors changed everything. When Constantine allied himself with the Christian God and gave the Church legal standing, he also introduced a temptation and a habit. The habit of looking to imperial power to secure ecclesiastical unity, and the temptation to define orthodoxy by decree. Councils became the instruments by which doctrine was hammered into form, and bishops learned to navigate not only scripture but court politics. The great ecumenical councils, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, were achievements of intellectual labor and also of imperial management. They sought to say, with philosophical precision, what the early believers had shouted with doxological joy, that Christ was truly divine and truly human, that the Father, Son, and Spirit were one God. These disputes were never merely academic. They were battles over salvation as people imagined it, and therefore over the very meaning of the faith. But even in these councils, differences in East and West began to show. The East, heir to Greek philosophy and to an empire still vigorous, developed a taste for subtle metaphysical distinctions. It could argue for generations about the relation of nature to person, about how the divine and human were united in Christ without confusion or division. The West, less trained in Greek metaphysics and more shaped by law, tended to approach doctrine in terms of authority, discipline, and practical piety. It produced fewer theologians of speculative genius and more organizers of ecclesiastical life. Augustine of Hippo, Latin Christianity's greatest mind, would become immensely influential, but even his brilliance carried a different flavor, a psychological depth, a moral earnestness, and a passion for the sovereignty of grace that contrasted with the East's more liturgical and mystical temperament. Then geography and history sharpened the divergence. In 330, Constantine founded Constantinople, a new capital on the Bosporus, strategically placed between Europe and Asia, economically linked to the rich eastern provinces, and psychologically suited to an emperor who wanted to be Christian without ceasing to be imperial. The old Rome did not cease to matter. It was still the symbolic center of the empire and the site of ancient prestige. But power migrated. Later, the administrative division of the empire and the eventual collapse of imperial authority in the West created two different worlds. In the East, the empire survived, bureaucratic, ceremonial, and self-conscious, calling itself Roman even when its language and culture were predominantly Greek. In the West, after 476, the emperor in Italy became a memory, and the barbarian kingdoms rose on the ruins of Roman administration. Amid this collapse, the Bishop of Rome, one of the few figures with continuity, literacy, and an institution that transcended tribes, grew in practical authority. The papacy became, by necessity, a substitute for the absent state, negotiating with invaders, organizing relief, preserving learning, and gradually gathering the legal and moral weight that a vacuum invites. Thus, the same religion inhabited two different political ecologies. In Byzantium, the emperor remained the protector and often the manager of the church. The Bishop of Constantinople, seated in the imperial city, could scarcely avoid becoming an ecclesiastical counterpart to the emperor, a patriarch at court, sometimes a conscience, sometimes a collaborator, always entangled in the state's fate. In the West, the Pope had no emperor nearby to dominate him until new emperors appeared in German lands, and so he could imagine, and increasingly assert, a kind of universal jurisdiction. Where Byzantium tended toward what later critics would call Caesaropapism, the West tended toward a papal monarchy, especially when the reform movements of the 11th century centralized power in Rome and demanded obedience as the price of purity. Language, too, became destiny. When the West gradually lost fluent Greek, it lost access to many Eastern theological texts except through translation, and translation is never innocent. Greek terms like ousia and hypostasis, so crucial in Trinitarian debates, had no perfect Latin equivalents. Misunderstandings multiplied, not always because either side was foolish, but because the conceptual furniture of the two cultures differed. Greek Christians prayed and wrote in a language that had carried Plato and Aristotle. Latin Christians prayed and legislated in a tongue that had carried Roman law. Even when they meant the same thing, they often said it differently, and the differences of phrasing hardened into differences of conviction. Alongside these deep currents were innumerable minor distinctions, some truly theological, some liturgical, some merely customary, which by the 11th century had accumulated like the grievances in a long marriage. Eastern priests, except for bishops, could be married. Western clergy increasingly emphasized celibacy as a sign of devotion and as a practical policy to prevent church property from becoming hereditary. The East used leavened bread in the Eucharist. Much of the West used unleavened bread, connecting the rite more directly to the Passover associations in the Gospel narratives. The East fasted on Saturdays in Lent. The West did not. The East permitted certain differences in ritual and discipline among its various rites. The West, especially under reforming popes, pushed toward uniformity as a sign of unity. If these had been the only matters at stake, Christendom might have accommodated them with the easy pluralism that large religions often display when power is not at issue. But power was always at issue. The most persistent question, like a bass note under all the liturgical melodies, was the question of primacy. What did it mean, in practice, to say that Rome held a special place? In the early centuries, Rome was often treated as a court of appeal. It had prestige and sometimes exercised influence, but the East tended to interpret primacy as honor. Rome first among equals, while the West increasingly interpreted it as jurisdiction, the Pope as the supreme bishop with authority over all churches. Byzantium had an ancient sense of order in which the great sees formed a kind of collegiate leadership, later called the Pentarchy: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, each with defined territories and an assumption of mutual consultation. Rome, meanwhile, developed legal theories and ecclesiastical practices that made the Pope the final arbiter in disputes, and in time, the legislator of the whole Church. A significant early spark was struck at Chalcedon in 451. The council granted Constantinople equal privileges with Rome in ecclesiastical rank because it was the new imperial capital, a statement that made political sense in Byzantine eyes. Rome resisted this, not because it despised Constantinople as a city, but because it feared that the basis of ecclesiastical authority was being shifted from apostolic foundation to imperial convenience. The East could hardly separate the two. The West, having lost its emperor, clung more fiercely to apostolic claims. Here was an irony that history loves. The very absence of imperial power in the West strengthened the papacy's theological insistence on an authority independent of politics, while the very presence of imperial power in the East made the Church's hierarchy appear even to itself as a mirror of the state. The iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries deepened the estrangement. Byzantine emperors, seeking perhaps to purify religion, perhaps to control monastic wealth, and perhaps to placate Muslim critics, attacked the veneration of icons. The conflict convulsed the East, pitting emperors against monks and popular piety. Rome defended icons, partly from theological conviction and partly because it did not share the emperor's political anxieties. When Byzantine emperors tried to enforce iconoclasm, they alienated the papacy. When the papacy resisted, it drifted politically toward the rising power in the West, the Franks. That drift became a decisive turn in 800 when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans in Rome. To Byzantium, this was an outrageous usurpation. There was already a Roman emperor seated in Constantinople, and Rome had no right to create another. To the papacy and the Frankish court, it was an act of necessity and ambition, a new protector for Rome, a new order in the West, and a symbolic assertion that the empire could be reborn without Byzantium. From that moment, the political unity of Christendom was broken. And, as politics goes, so often goes ecclesiology. A church that is one in doctrine can still split when it is divided in allegiance. One might say, with some justice, that the Great Schism was prepared by the coronation of Charlemagne as much as by the quarrels of theologians. For once, Christendom had two rival emperors. It was only a matter of time before it had two rival conceptions of ecclesiastical headship. Byzantium, with its ancient imperial pride, could not easily accept a Western pope who acted like a sovereign over sovereigns. The West, with its newly awakened sense of independence, could not easily accept an Eastern patriarch who seemed to derive his authority from the emperor's shadow. Each side accused the other, and both accusations contained partial truth. Into this already tense world entered a theological phrase that would become a symbol of the West's assertiveness and the East's resistance, the filioque, and from the Son. The original Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, formulated in the 4th century, said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. In parts of the Latin West, beginning in Spain in the late 6th century, the phrase "and from the Son" was added to emphasize the Son's divinity against Arian tendencies. The addition spread gradually, especially through the Frankish realms. The Eastern Church objected on 2 grounds. First, that the theology of the Spirit's procession was being altered in a way that threatened, in Eastern eyes, the Father's unique role as the source within the Trinity. And second, that no local church had the right to alter a creed established by an ecumenical council. Here again, theology and authority were entwined. The East saw the filioque as doctrinal error and procedural arrogance. The West saw it as legitimate clarification and, increasingly, as an expression of Rome's right to define doctrine. For a time, even Rome hesitated. Popes could accept the theology in some form while resisting the unilateral insertion of the phrase into the creed's liturgical recitation. But pressure from the Frankish world and the general Western habit of doctrinal elaboration wore down resistance. By the early 11th century, the filioque was being recited in Rome itself. To Byzantium, this was not merely a liturgical detail. It was as if the West had taken the common inheritance of Christendom and, without consultation, remodeled it. A civilization that cherished the authority of councils could not accept a change imposed by custom and backed by papal power. The 9th century provided an earlier rehearsal of schism in what historians call the Photian controversy. In Constantinople, the Patriarch Ignatius was deposed under political pressure, and Photius, a layman of great learning, was elevated rapidly through ecclesiastical ranks to replace him. Rome protested, partly out of sympathy for Ignatius, partly out of its own theories of canonical order, and partly because of a larger geopolitical struggle, the competition for influence in Bulgaria, a newly Christianized region that could align with either Rome or Constantinople. Pope Nicholas I, a man of strong papal conviction, challenged the legitimacy of Photius and asserted Rome's authority to judge the case. Photius, equally strong-willed and armed with theological arguments, rejected Rome's claims and condemned the Western use of the filioque. Excommunications were exchanged, councils were held, and though later agreements restored a semblance of unity, the episode left behind a bitter memory. It taught Byzantium that Rome would act as judge over Eastern affairs. It taught Rome that Constantinople could defy it and mobilize theology in defense of autonomy. If one were to look for the emotional heart of the Great Schism, it might be found less in the intricacies of Trinitarian theology than in the wounded pride of great institutions. Rome believed itself responsible for the Church's unity and purity. Constantinople believed itself the guardian of the Church's tradition and the heir of Rome's empire. Each saw the other as betraying the common past. Each cultivated, in its own way, the conviction that it stood for order against innovation, Rome against Eastern compromise with emperors and doctrinal subtlety, the East against Western legalism and theological novelty. By the 11th century, the West was undergoing a moral and institutional reform that would sharpen its self-consciousness. The movement associated with Cluny, and later with the papacy, sought to free the Church from lay control, to enforce clerical celibacy, to end simony, and to assert Rome's leadership over bishops and princes. These aims were partly spiritual, partly administrative and partly political. But they produced a new papal tone, confident, centralized, uncompromising. The Pope became, in this reforming vision, not merely the Bishop of Rome, but the supreme pastor of the universal Church, with the authority to correct kings and to depose bishops. In a West where order was fragile and violence common, such centralization appeared as salvation. In the East, where order was maintained by an ancient state and where ecclesiastical life was woven into the fabric of imperial ceremony, such papal claims looked like revolution. Meanwhile, Byzantium faced its own pressures. The empire was still magnificent, but it was no longer secure. New enemies pressed on its frontiers. In the East, the rising power of the Seljuk Turks. In the West, the Normans, who were carving out principalities in southern Italy and Sicily. These Normans, though often rough adventurers, were also instruments of Latin Christianity's expansion. They displaced Greek bishops, imposed Latin rites in areas that had long been Greek, and brought local religious tensions into the broader rivalry between Rome and Constantinople. The Byzantine court, ever attuned to nuance and ceremony, could not ignore the insult of seeing Greek liturgy suppressed under Latin swords. In Constantinople at this time rose Michael Cerularius, patriarch from 1043 to 1059, a man who embodied the East's ecclesiastical pride and political instinct. Cerularius was not merely a churchman, he was a politician in a city where church and state were intimate partners. He had the sternness of a reformer and the sharpness of a courtier. He resented Latin encroachments and distrusted papal pretensions. When Latin churches in Constantinople practiced their rites openly, especially their use of unleavened bread, Cerularius and his allies denounced them. At one point, Latin churches in the city were closed and their altars reportedly desecrated. Whether every detail of these actions is as later polemicists claimed, the intent was clear. Constantinople would not tolerate in its capital what it considered an improper or arrogant Western practice. Pope Leo IX, for his part, was a reforming pope of the new type, energetic, morally serious, convinced of Rome's authority. He was also entangled in the politics of the Normans. Seeking to curb Norman power in Italy, he involved himself militarily and suffered a humiliating defeat at Civitate in 1053, after which he was held in honorable captivity. That a pope could be captured by warlords was itself a sign of the West's turbulence, but it also intensified Leo's desire to assert spiritual authority even when temporal power faltered. In response to Cerularius's actions and the broader tensions, Leo sent legates to Constantinople with letters that combined theological argument, canonical claims, and diplomatic appeal. Among these legates, Humbert was the most formidable and the least flexible. A scholar of canon law and an ardent supporter of reform, he carried within him the West's new legal and moral confidence. He was also, by temperament, ill-suited to Byzantine subtlety. Constantinople's diplomacy required patience, an appreciation of ceremony, and an ability to distinguish between personal insult and institutional negotiation. Humbert, like many men of his kind, mistook compromise for weakness and formality for evasion. When he arrived in the imperial city, he entered a world whose very manners could seem to him like hypocrisy. The elaborate titles, the long audiences, the courtly delays. Byzantines, for their part, might see Humbert's bluntness as barbarian arrogance, Frankish, Latin, uncouth. The emperor at the time, Constantine IX, Monomachos, had reasons to seek peace with Rome. Byzantium needed allies against the Normans and against threats that were gathering in the east. The emperor was, as emperors often are, more pragmatic than patriarchs. He could afford religious compromise if it served political survival. Cerularius, however, was less inclined to bend, and the Byzantine people and clergy, shaped by centuries of tradition and proud of their city's role, were suspicious of Rome. A negotiation thus unfolded in a triangle of interests. A pope's envoys determined to assert authority, a patriarch determined to resist, and an emperor determined to avoid rupture. The talks went badly. Carolarius refused at crucial moments to meet the legates as they wished, perhaps to signal that he would not be treated as a subordinate. Humbert interpreted delays as insolence. Each side arrived with a list of grievances that had been compiled by polemicists rather than by peacemakers. The legates attacked Eastern practices, clerical marriage, fasting rules, the omission of the filioque, and, more fundamentally, they demanded recognition of Rome's primacy in a juridical sense. The Byzantines countered with their own accusations that the Latins had altered the creed, that they practiced innovations, that they claimed authority beyond their rights. Behind these lists lay the unspoken truth. Neither side trusted the other's intentions. Then history played one of its sardonic tricks. Pope Leo IX died in April 1054, before the crisis reached its ceremonial climax. In strict canonical terms, the legates' authority died with him. They were representatives of a pope who was no longer alive. In a less legalistic world, this might have become an opening for delay and reconsideration. In Humbert's world, it became an inconvenience. The legates proceeded as if their mandate were perpetual, perhaps believing that Rome's authority was not confined to the life of a man, or perhaps simply unwilling to admit weakness. Carolarius may have known of Leo's death, and may have used it as further reason to dismiss the legates. Thus, a negotiation that required delicacy was conducted in an atmosphere of procedural ambiguity and mutual contempt. The scene in Hagia Sophia, with its dramatic placing of the bull on the altar, was the climax of this failed diplomacy. The document excommunicated Carolarius and his supporters, accusing them of various errors. The Byzantines were outraged not merely by the content, but by the manner. To deliver such a sentence in the heart of the empire's chief church during liturgy was a calculated insult. Carolarius responded by convening a synod that condemned the legates and, in effect, rejected Rome's claims. The anathemas were, strictly speaking, directed at persons. Humbert and his companions on one side, Carolarius and his circle on the other. They did not formally excommunicate whole churches, but symbols outrun legal precision. The populace and clergy heard what they were meant to hear. Rome had condemned Constantinople. Constantinople had condemned Rome. Even then, the schism was not instantly experienced as an irrevocable separation across all Christendom. Communion between East and West had been strained before. It continued in some places for a time. Merchants still traded, pilgrims still traveled, diplomats still negotiated. The machinery of everyday life does not stop because theologians have quarreled. But the event fixed a narrative. It gave both sides a date to remember, a moment to point to, a moral drama in which each could cast itself as the wronged party and the other as the aggressor. In history, as in law, precedent matters. And once a precedent is established, later conflicts interpret themselves through it. The deeper consequences unfolded over centuries. The Crusades, which began at the end of the 11th century, might have offered a chance for reconciliation. Latin knights marching to aid Byzantium against Muslim powers, Eastern and Western Christians united in common cause. In practice, they often deepened the rift. The Byzantines, heirs to an ancient statecraft, found the Crusaders undisciplined and greedy. The Crusaders found the Byzantines subtle, delaying, and untrustworthy. Each judged the other by its own standards. The Byzantines expected obedience to imperial coordination. The Crusaders expected gratitude and straightforward alliance. Misunderstandings multiplied, and with them resentment. Even when cooperation occurred, it was colored by suspicion. The catastrophe of 1204 made suspicion into hatred. The Fourth Crusade, diverted from its original aim, ended with the sack of Constantinople by Latin forces. A Christian army, ostensibly fighting for the Holy Land, turned its weapons on the greatest Christian city of the East. Churches were looted, relics were stolen and carried westward, icons were desecrated, civilians suffered. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople, a harsh parody of Roman continuity. For Byzantines, this was not merely political conquest, it was sacrilege, a betrayal that confirmed every fear about Latin motives. For Latins, some justified the event as punishment for Byzantine duplicity. Others were ashamed, but the deed could not be undone. If 1054 had been a ceremonial quarrel, 1240 was a wound in flesh. It created memories that liturgical differences could never erase. Meanwhile, each church developed along its own path. The Latin West continued to elaborate its theology with scholastic precision. It defined doctrines with a juridical clarity that suited its temperament, purgatory, indulgences, the nature of sacramental grace. It refined papal authority into a theory of universal jurisdiction, supported by canon law and reinforced by the papacy's role in Western politics. The Greek East, centered increasingly in monastic spirituality and liturgical continuity, developed a theology of participation and deification, the soul's union with God as an experience of divine energies rather than as a legal acquittal. It preserved the ancient liturgies with a reverence that made change feel like betrayal. Its ecclesiology remained conciliar. Bishops gathered in synod. Patriarchs held honor but not absolute command. These differences were not merely doctrinal, they were civilizational. Attempts at reunion occurred, usually under political pressure. When Byzantium was threatened, by Western powers or by Turkish advance, emperors sometimes sought union with Rome in exchange for military aid. The Council of Lyons, in 1274, produced a formal agreement that accepted papal primacy and the filioque, but it was deeply unpopular in Byzantium and quickly collapsed after the emperor's death. A more ambitious attempt came at the Council of Florence in 1439, where Greek and Latin delegates debated fiercely and produced another union formula. Many Eastern bishops signed, exhausted and hoping for Western help against the Ottomans, but when they returned home, they found monks and laity resistant. The union was seen as capitulation. In the end, Western aid proved insufficient or too late, and Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The fall sealed a new reality. The Byzantine Empire, which had been the political matrix of Eastern Orthodoxy, was gone. The Church survived under Muslim rule, preserving identity through liturgy and community, rather than through empire. From the Western perspective, the East's refusal to submit to Rome became a mark of obstinacy. From the Eastern perspective, Rome's insistence on submission became a mark of tyranny. Each side developed polemical literature that caricatured the other. Latins accused Greeks of schism and theological error. Greeks accused Latins of heresy and arrogance. Even saints and scholars who admired the other tradition did so as exceptions to a general distrust. In time, the Great Schism became part of each identity. The West as the universal church under one head, the East as the true guardian of the ancient faith against innovation. It is tempting, especially for theologians, to reduce the schism to the filioque, or to papal primacy, as if a single doctrinal adjustment could have preserved unity. But history rarely yields to such neat causality. The filioque was both a theological issue and a symbol of authority. Primacy was both a question of ecclesiology and a question of political habit. Behind these were the slow separations of language, culture, and political experience. The East had learned to live with an emperor and to think of unity in terms of harmony among great seas. The West had learned to live without an emperor and to think of unity in terms of a central authority that could impose order. Each was responding to its circumstances. Each, in its own way, was trying to solve the same problem: how to preserve a universal faith in a world of fractious powers and diverse peoples. The tragedy is that their solutions became mutually exclusive. Consider the very notion of authority. In Byzantium, authority was often displayed in liturgy and ceremony. The empire was a theology acted out in gold and chant. The emperor's presence in church, the patriarch's blessing, the processions, the icons, all formed a coherent vision of cosmos and society. The church's unity was experienced as aesthetic and communal, a shared rite, a shared calendar, a shared memory of saints. Rome's authority, by contrast, increasingly took legal form. It issued decrees, judged disputes, and claimed the power to bind and loose across Christendom. The Roman mind, shaped by law, sought clarity. The Byzantine mind, shaped by a synthesis of philosophy and ceremony, sought harmony. Law and harmony are not enemies, but they can become rivals when each claims to be the essence of unity. Even the conceptions of sin and salvation, though overlapping, carried different emphases. The West, influenced by Augustine and by the moral anxieties of a violent world, tended to speak of original sin, guilt, and justification. The East, influenced by Greek fathers and by a more contemplative monastic tradition, tended to speak of death, corruption, and healing. The West built an edifice of penitential practice and juridical sacramentalism. The East cultivated a medicine of the soul through liturgy, fasting, and the pursuit of inner prayer. These are broad generalizations, and there were always cross-currents, but over centuries they produced different religious atmospheres. When atmospheres differ, even shared doctrines can feel foreign. The bread dispute, the quarrel over leavened versus unleavened, illustrates how small customs can become large symbols. Bread is humble. It is the food of peasants, the staple of cities, the daily miracle of agriculture and labor. Yet in the Eucharist, it becomes the center of Christian worship. To insist that only one kind of bread is valid is to insist that one culture's habit is the measure of salvation. Cerularius's attack on azymes was thus not mere pedantry. It was a defense of identity. Humbert's insistence on Latin usage was not mere stubbornness. It was an assertion that Rome's authority transcended local custom. In such disputes, people are not really fighting over bread. They are fighting over who gets to define the terms of belonging. One must also remember the psychology of borderlands. Southern Italy, where Greek and Latin rites met, became a zone of friction. Normans, papal ambitions, Byzantine claims, all collided there. What might have remained a theological disagreement was repeatedly translated into administrative coercion. Bishops replaced, churches re-ritualized, communities pressured. Wherever the two traditions touched directly, they tended to provoke each other. Distance might have permitted tolerance. Proximity demanded decisions. The very places where East and West could have learned from one another became places where they were forced to choose. If we return in imagination to that day in Hagia Sophia, we might see in the scene not only a rupture, but a misunderstanding staged in ritual form. Humbert, raised in a West that was learning to conceive of the Church as an institution ruled from a center, acted as one who believed that a formal sentence could correct disorder. Cerularius, raised in an East that conceived of the Church as the continuation of apostolic tradition in a liturgical community, perceived the sentence as an invasion. The altar between them, meant to symbolize unity in Christ, became a table on which human claims of precedence were laid. The tragedy of the Great Schism is that both sides believed themselves defenders of unity, yet each defended a different kind of unity. And still, history does not end with separation. The centuries after 1054 were not a simple story of hostility. There were periods of cooperation and mutual influence. Byzantine scholars fled westward before and after the fall of Constantinople, bringing Greek manuscripts that helped fertilize the Renaissance. Western monastic and scholastic thought occasionally found admirers in the East, and Eastern mystical texts found readers in the West. Political necessity sometimes forced alliances, even polemics, by compelling each side to articulate its beliefs, clarified doctrines that might otherwise have remained implicit. The schism hardened boundaries, but it also made each tradition more self-conscious, more defined. In the modern era, when the political structures that had shaped the schism have largely vanished, no Byzantine emperor, no medieval papal state in the old sense, there has been a renewal of dialogue. In 1965, the mutual excommunications of 1054 were formally lifted by Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras, a gesture that did not erase doctrinal differences but acknowledged that ancient condemnations should not govern contemporary relations. Subsequent theological commissions have explored the issues of primacy and synodality, seeking ways to understand how Rome's claim to a special role might be reconciled with the East's conciliar tradition. Yet the schism remains, not because people enjoy division, but because the questions at its heart, authority, tradition, identity, are stubborn questions that resist easy formulas. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that religious unity depends not only on doctrine, but on the slow work of mutual comprehension. The East and West did not simply disagree, they often failed to understand what the other meant by its terms. When the West said primacy, it often meant a juridical power necessary for order. When the East heard primacy, it heard a threat to the collegial structure of the ancient Church. When the East insisted on the Father as the single source within the Trinity, it meant to protect a particular balance in the mystery of God. When the West heard this, it sometimes suspected a diminishing of the Son's role. Each side defended what it cherished, but in defense it sometimes caricatured the other, and caricature is the easiest way to make reconciliation impossible. There is also the persistent human tendency to sacralize our own habits. A liturgy becomes the liturgy. A theological idiom becomes the faith. A political arrangement becomes the divine order. In the long span of history, such sacralization is both understandable and perilous. It is understandable because communities need stability. It is perilous because stability can harden into rigidity, and rigidity into condemnation. The Great Schism shows how a religion that preaches love can become, in institutional hands, a system of exclusions. It also shows how faith, when bound too tightly to empire, inherits the empire's rivalries. To call the schism great is to acknowledge its scope. It divided not only bishops, but cultures. It helped shape Europe's later history. The Latin West, under papal leadership, and later fractured by the Protestant Reformation, developed political forms and intellectual traditions that differed markedly from those of Eastern Orthodox lands, where church identity often served as a vessel for national survival under foreign rule. One can trace, with caution, the echoes of this division in later misunderstandings between Western and Eastern Europe. Differing assumptions about authority, community, and the relation of religion to state. It would be an exaggeration to blame 1054 for all later divergences, but it would be blindness not to see that the separation of Christendom altered the trajectory of civilizations. And yet, if one looks beyond institutions to the lived religion of ordinary believers, one may find a quieter continuity. Greek and Latin Christians alike prayed before icons or crucifixes, baptized their children, mourned their dead, feared sin, hoped for mercy, and found in liturgy a kind of ordered beauty against the chaos of life. The schism was experienced most sharply by clergy and intellectuals. Peasants and artisans often cared less about the procession of the Spirit than about the reliability of harvests and the justice of landlords. It is one of the ironies of religious history that the highest disputes can be invisible to the majority, and yet those disputes can shape the structures that govern the majority's lives. In that light, the bull on the altar appears as both an end and an admission, an end to the pretense of easy unity, and an admission that the two worlds had grown too far apart to be held together by courtesy. Humbert's gesture was dramatic, but it was also a confession of failure of diplomacy, of patience, of imagination. Cerularius's response was firm, but it too was a confession that Byzantium would rather risk isolation than accept a hierarchy it found alien. Both men acted as their worlds had trained them to act. History often turns on such men, not because they are uniquely wicked or uniquely wise, but because they embody the pressure of their age and give it a decisive form. If we seek, finally, to understand why the Great Schism happened, we might say that it arose from an attempt to solve the problem of unity in a changing world. The early church had been a network. The imperial church became an institution, and institutions require structures of authority. But authority can take different shapes: legal centralization, conciliar balance, imperial coordination, monastic influence. East and West chose different shapes under different pressures. When they tried to impose their chosen shape on one another, unity became coercion, and coercion provoked resistance. Words like filioque and primacy became battlegrounds because they carried beneath their theology a question of who would lead and how. In the end, perhaps the most poignant truth is that the schism was not inevitable, and yet once it happened, it became, in human terms, almost irreversible. It was not inevitable because individuals and choices mattered. Better tempers and wiser statesmanship might have delayed or softened it. It became nearly irreversible because memory matters even more. Institutions remember injuries, liturgies remember separations, nations remember betrayals. The sack of 1204, more than the bull of 1054, lodged itself in the Orthodox imagination as a proof that the West was not merely mistaken, but dangerous. The West, for its part, came to see the East as a stubborn refusal of rightful order. Each memory reinforced itself through teaching and ritual. And so the gold dome of Hagia Sophia, which had watched Humber's brief performance, continued to watch other dramas. It would see emperors fall, dynasties rise, armies march, and finally the crescent replace the cross atop the city's political life. The church that had once filled it with chant would become, for centuries, a church without its empire. Rome, meanwhile, would see its own transformations: papal grandeur, papal humiliation, reformation, modernity. The schism that began as a quarrel within a single civilization became a boundary between two. It remains, even now, one of history's lasting reminders that unity is not merely a doctrine to be affirmed, but a labor to be sustained, a labor of translation across languages, of humility across traditions, of patience across pride. Without that labor, even a shared altar can become a place where one sets down, with a gesture, the weight of a world divided.